Left at the altar, paraplegic billionaire puts his housekeeper in the bride's place, and when the bride saw her future husband at the altar, all she could see was a paraplegic man and nothing more. She fled without a backward glance, heedless of the heart of the man who awaited her, seated in a wheelchair, watching as she ran toward the church doors. Outrage and commotion swept through the guests, but the billionaire decided he would be married that day. He took the hand of his faithful housekeeper, who was attending to him during the ceremony, and suddenly brought her to the altar, asking, "Will you marry me?" And the most surprising thing was, to everyone's astonishment, she answered, "Yes." The sun was setting over the exclusive coastline of Malibu, California, bathing Alexander Sterling's imposing mansion in golden hues. From the vast window of his office, Alexander watched the Pacific Ocean as he swiveled his custom-made titanium wheelchair, a constant reminder of the accident that had transformed his life 5 years ago. At 38, Alexander was considered one of America's most brilliant entrepreneurs. His company, Sterling Dynamics, had revolutionized the national tech industry with artificial intelligence software now used by federal agencies and Fortune 500 corporations across North America. Forbes had ranked him among the 10 wealthiest men under 40 in the country, with a fortune estimated at over $3 billion. "Mr. Sterling, will you be needing anything else before I leave?" asked Raymond, his personal assistant, interrupting his thoughts. "No, thank you. You can go," he replied, without shifting his gaze from the horizon. When the door closed, Alexander sighed deeply. The 20-room mansion, the collection of luxury cars adapted to his condition, the Swiss watches that adorned his wrist, none of it filled the void he'd felt since the accident. His paraplegia wasn't what tormented him. He had learned to live with it. It was the loneliness. With a precise movement, he turned his chair and headed for the private elevator that connected every floor of the mansion. The doors opened into the main foyer, where Dolores, his head housekeeper, was overseeing the final preparations for that night's event. "Mr. Sterling, everything is ready for the dinner. The caterers will arrive in an hour, and the chef is already preparing the menu you requested," Dolores reported efficiently. "Perfect. I'll be in my room. Let me know when the first guests arrive." The Sterling Foundation for Children with Disabilities was holding its annual fundraising gala. It was the most important event on his philanthropic calendar, but for Alexander, it had become more of an obligation than a passion. He had created the foundation with genuine enthusiasm after his accident. Now, 3 years later, he felt that even his charity work had become just another ornament for his public image. That evening, the mansion gleamed with lights strategically placed to highlight its sprawling modern architecture. Dozens of luxury vehicles began to arrive, and the American elite paraded through the main entrance. Politicians, tech moguls, celebrities, all came as much for the charitable cause as for the chance to be seen at such a prestigious event. Alexander, impeccably dressed in a navy blue tailor-made suit, greeted his guests with a rehearsed smile. No one could guess the profound disinterest he felt behind that facade of calculated charm. "Alexander, darling, what a marvelous event you've organized," exclaimed Claudia Fernandez, a television host known for her romances with wealthy men. She leaned in to kiss him on both cheeks, leaving a cloud of French perfume in her wake. The night progressed amidst glasses of champagne, silent auctions, and speeches about inclusion and support for disabled children. Alexander played his part perfectly, but his mind wandered far away until he saw her. She entered just as dinner was about to be served, a tall woman with black hair that fell like silk over her bare shoulders. Her red dress contrasted with the predominant sobriety of the other guests' attire. She didn't need to command attention. Attention naturally gravitated toward her. "Who is she?" Alexander asked his assistant, who immediately consulted the guest list. "Valentina Rivas, sir. International model. She's here as the Spanish ambassador's +1, but apparently they arrived separately." Alexander couldn't look away. There was something about her that defied the event's artificial atmosphere. When their eyes met across the room, she held his gaze with a confidence that intrigued him. With a discreet gesture, he had Raymond invite her to his table. "Mr. Sterling, it's an honor to meet you," Valentina said, her voice carrying a faint, unplaceable European accent. "Your work with the foundation is admirable. Please call me Alexander, and the honor is mine." The conversation flowed with an ease Alexander had forgotten could exist. Valentina spoke of her travels, of the runways in Milan and Paris, but also of literature and art, with a knowledge that surprised the entrepreneur. For the first time in a long time, Alexander found himself genuinely interested in another person. At the end of the night, as the guests began to depart, Alexander didn't want his conversation with Valentina to end. "I'd like to see you again," he said, with an uncharacteristic frankness. "Perhaps somewhere less formal." Valentina smiled, pulling a card from her small clutch. "I'll be in LA for 2 more weeks. Call me if you want to continue our conversation about Fitzgerald." In the following days, Alexander found a new energy. Breakfasts in the garden of a quiet cafe in Santa Monica, private tours of the Getty Center, dinners in discreet restaurants where Valentina made him laugh in a way he hadn't in years. For the first time since his accident, Alexander began to feel alive again. What started as a mutual interest soon blossomed into a relationship that graced the covers of society magazines, the tech billionaire and the international supermodel, the romance of the year. Alexander, always protective of his privacy, now found himself enjoying the attention. Valentina was the perfect accessory for his public image, beautiful, sophisticated, international. 6 months later, during a dinner on his mansion's terrace overlooking the Pacific, Alexander asked the question the media had been anticipating. "Valentina, will you marry me?" Her affirmative answer was met with a shower of flashes from paparazzi boats that had been conveniently informed of the moment. The engagement news made the front pages the next day. What no one saw, not even Alexander himself, was the calculating look in Valentina's eyes when she thought no one was watching. Nor did they notice the sad expression in the eyes of Marisol, the young housekeeper who served champagne as the happy couple celebrated their engagement. Thus began the path to a wedding that promised to be the social event of the year. Alexander Sterling, the paraplegic billionaire who had found love after years of loneliness. A perfect story for the magazines, a flawless facade for a void that, unbeknownst to him, was about to grow much deeper. The Sterling mansion was buzzing with activity as preparations for the wedding of the year moved at full speed. Marisol Juarez, just 23, moved through the chaos with the discretion of a shadow, efficiently carrying out each of her tasks. She had been hired 6 months prior, recommended by Dolores, the head housekeeper, who was her mother's aunt, and had seen an opportunity for the young woman to leave her small town in California's Central Valley for a better future. "Marisol, I need you to take these catalogs to Mr. Sterling's study," Dolores ordered, handing her a stack of binders with samples of invitations and decorations. "Miss Rivas wants him to review them before the meeting with the wedding planner." "Yes, Ms. Dolores," Marisol replied, taking the catalogs carefully. As she walked down the long Italian marble hallways, Marisol mentally reviewed her tasks for the day. At 11, she had to ensure the florist had access to the garden for measurements. At 1, receive the new shipment of Egyptian cotton sheets Valentina had demanded for all the guest rooms. At 3, assist Dolores in supervising the cleaning of the French porcelain dinnerware to be used at the rehearsal dinner. Upon reaching the study, she knocked softly. "Come in," Alexander's voice answered from within. Marisol entered with her eyes lowered, as she had been taught. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, I have the catalogues Miss Rivas asked for." Alexander barely looked up from his computer. "Leave them there, please," he said, vaguely gesturing toward a side table. "Do you need anything else, sir?" "No, thank you. Marisol," she finished for him, used to him forgetting her name. "Yes, Marisol. Thank you." She left as quietly as she had entered. To Mr. Sterling, she was like the paintings on the walls or the plants in the corners, part of the decor, present but invisible. For Marisol, however, every interaction with him was etched in her memory. She had learned a lot about her employer in these 6 months. She knew he preferred his coffee black in the morning, but with a touch of cinnamon when he worked late, that he kept a collection of poetry books no one else touched, that sometimes when he thought he was alone, he played the piano with a melancholy that gave her chills. And above all, she had noticed how his gaze, once dull according to the older staff, now shone when he spoke of his wedding. But Marisol had also learned a lot about Valentina Rivas, and what she knew sent a chill down her spine. "Stupid girl. How dare you put white roses in my room when I specifically asked for orchids?" Valentina's voice echoed down the hall as Marisol headed to the kitchen. Turning the corner, she found Lucy, one of the younger maids, trembling as Valentina berated her. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" "I'm sorry, miss," Lucy mumbled, her eyes filling with tears. The florist said the orchids would arrive tomorrow, and I thought, "That's your problem," Valentina interrupted, venom in her voice. "You're not paid to think." Marisol paused, debating whether to continue on her way or intervene. Valentina noticed her and instantly changed her expression. "Ah, Marisol, is it? I need you to call the florist and tell them if my orchids aren't here by this afternoon, I'll find another vendor for the wedding and get this useless girl out of my sight." As soon as Valentina walked away, Marisol went to comfort Lucy. It wasn't the first time she had witnessed such a scene. When Alexander wasn't present, Valentina transformed. The sweet, sophisticated model vanished, revealing a calculating and cruel woman. "Don't cry, Lucy. She's like that with everyone," Marisol whispered, offering her a tissue. "I don't understand how Mr. Sterling doesn't see it," Lucy replied through sobs. Marisol didn't understand either. The contrast between the Valentina all the employees knew and the one Alexander saw was so stark it was like they were two different people. That afternoon, while organizing Valentina's wardrobe, who had gone out for a dress fitting with her bridesmaids, Marisol heard the phone in the room ring. She hesitated for a few seconds before answering. "Sterling residence, good afternoon." "Is Valentina there?" a male voice with a foreign accent asked. "Miss Rivas is not available at the moment. Would you like to leave a message?" There was a brief silence. "Tell her Carlos called, and that she shouldn't forget our appointment tomorrow." "May I ask what it's about, so I can note it down correctly?" Marisol added, feeling a pang of suspicion. The laugh on the other end of the line unnerved her. "She knows exactly what it's about, sweetheart. Just tell her not to miss it if she wants to keep up with our agreement." After hanging up, Marisol stood motionless in front of the phone. It wasn't the first suspicious call Valentina had received. She had noticed her secret conversations in the garden, her mysterious shopping trips that lasted for hours, and how she'd hastily hide her phone whenever Alexander appeared. As she finished organizing the clothes, she found something that confirmed her worst fears. An envelope hidden among Valentina's lingerie. She shouldn't have opened it, but something inside pushed her to. It contained photographs of Valentina with a handsome man in clearly intimate situations, along with a handwritten note. "So you don't forget what you have to lose if you don't play your part. The wedding has to happen, darling. We need that money." Marisol's heart pounded as she put everything back in its place. Now she understood Valentina's game perfectly. Her relationship with Alexander was nothing but a sham, a calculated plan to get her hands on his fortune. That night, while serving dinner to Alexander and Valentina, she watched how he looked at her with genuine adoration while she perfectly played the part of the enamored fiancé. Rage and helplessness churned in Marisol's chest. She wanted to scream the truth, to unmask that woman, to protect her employer from the pain that surely awaited him. But who would believe the word of a simple housekeeper against that of Valentina Rivas? She would probably be fired for slander, sent back to her town in disgrace, and worst of all, Alexander would remain blind to his fiancée's true nature. "Is something wrong, Marisol?" Alexander's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She had been standing by the table for so long, lost in her reflections, that she had drawn his attention. "No, sir. Excuse me," she replied quickly, retreating to the kitchen. For the first time since she started working there, Alexander had truly looked at her, and though it was just for a moment, Marisol felt that she was finally visible. The Sterling mansion had become a veritable beehive. Just 1 week before the ceremony, preparations for the most anticipated event in American high society had reached their peak. Marisol had barely slept 4 hours a night for the past week, rushing from one end of the house to the other to meet the endless demands of Valentina and the wedding planners. That morning, as she was double-checking the RSVP list in Alexander's study, she heard his voice from the hallway. "Marisol, have you seen the contract I left on my desk? Mendoza will be here in an hour for us to sign it." "Yes, sir. It's filed in the blue folder," she replied, pointing to the document. Alexander wheeled himself over and took the folder. For a second, their fingers brushed, sending an electric jolt up Marisol's arm. "Thank you. You know, Valentina was very insistent on this prenuptial agreement. I told her it wasn't necessary, that I trust her completely, but she says it's to protect us both." Marisol kept her expression neutral, though a growing unease churned inside her. A prenup proposed by Valentina. Something didn't add up. "Do you need me to check anything else, sir?" she asked, avoiding comment on the matter. "No, thank you. You've already done so much," he replied with a smile he rarely directed at the staff. "You must be exhausted with all these preparations." "It's my job, sir." "Even so, I appreciate it. Valentina says you're the only one who understands exactly what she needs." Marisol suppressed a wince. If only Alexander knew what Valentina said about her when he wasn't around. Later that day, while bringing clean towels to the master bathroom, Marisol heard voices coming from Valentina's room. The door was ajar, and though she knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, something in the agitated tone made her stop. "I'm telling you, it's perfect, Carlos," Valentina was saying in a low, intense voice. "The lawyer is coming today. Once he signs the contract, everything will be locked in." "And what if he backs out at the last minute?" replied a male voice Marisol recognized as the man from the phone call. "He won't. He has too much pride. Besides, he's so in love he'd sign his own death warrant if I asked him with a smile." The cruel laugh that followed made Marisol's stomach turn. "And the plan is still the same?" Carlos asked. "Of course. The contract states that if one of us leaves the other before the ceremony, they have to pay a $10 million penalty." Valentina paused dramatically. "But if the abandonment happens during the ceremony, the compensation doubles. 20 million, can you imagine? And the best part is, I won't have to spend a single night as a cripple's wife." Marisol had to cover her mouth to keep from gasping. The cruelty with which Valentina referred to Alexander, the man who adored her, was unbearable. "And what if you decide to stay with him?" Carlos asked. "The guy's a billionaire, darling. You could get a lot more in the long run. Are you crazy? Can you see me playing nurse to a paraplegic for the rest of my life? Not for all his money. Besides, you and I have plans, remember? Those yachts in Saint-Tropez won't pay for themselves." Marisol felt nauseous. She clutched the towels to her chest and backed away silently, terrified of being discovered. Her mind raced, processing what she had just heard. Not only was Valentina planning to leave Alexander, but she had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to extort him first. She would leave him standing at the altar in front of hundreds of guests just to maximize her financial gain. For the next few hours, Marisol went about her duties mechanically, her mind torn between the information she held and the moral dilemma it presented. Should she tell Alexander what she'd heard? Would he believe her? Or worse, would he accuse her of inventing lies out of jealousy or envy? That afternoon, while arranging the newly arrived centerpieces in the main hall, Alexander appeared with a satisfied look on his face. "All set, Marisol. We signed the contract and now all that's left is to wait for the big day," he commented, approaching to inspect the decorations. "What do you think of the arrangements?" "Valentina chose them herself." "They're beautiful, sir," she answered automatically. "Are you all right? You seem worried." The sincere concern in his voice nearly broke Marisol's composure. How could this good man be so blind? "I'm fine, just tired," she lied, avoiding his gaze. "I understand. These are intense days for everyone." He paused, then added, "You know, sometimes I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. After the accident, I thought no one could ever truly love me. And then Valentina came along." Every word was like a knife in Marisol's heart. She wanted to scream the truth at him, to shake him until he saw the reality right in front of him, but instead, she just nodded silently. That night, alone in her small room in the staff quarters, Marisol couldn't sleep. The image of Alexander being humiliated in front of hundreds of guests abandoned at the altar tormented her. And worse, the idea that he would have to pay a fortune to the woman who had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. She took out her old rosary, a gift from her grandmother, and prayed for guidance. What should she do? If she spoke up, she would almost certainly lose her job. She'd heard from previous staff how Valentina had gotten a maid fired for daring to criticize one of her dresses. What would she do to someone who threatened her multi-million-dollar plans? But if she stayed silent, she would be allowing a terrible injustice to be committed against a man who, despite his initial distance, had always treated her with respect, and lately, even with kindness. 2 days later, as the mansion was transformed with flowers, lights, and decorations for the rehearsal dinner, Marisol made a decision. She would speak to Alexander that night, after everyone had left. She would tell him everything she had seen and heard, and she would accept the consequences, whatever they may be. Her heart pounding, she waited in the hallway outside the study, where she knew Alexander would be working late, as was his custom. At 11 o'clock, when the mansion finally fell silent, she took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Alexander's voice answered from within. With trembling hands and a dry throat, Marisol entered, closing the door behind her. It was the moment of truth. Alexander Sterling's face remained impassive as Marisol, her voice trembling with nerves, told him everything she had discovered. She told him about the suspicious phone calls, the hidden photographs, and finally, the devastating conversation she had overheard between Valentina and Carlos. And then she said she wouldn't have to spend a single night as the wife of you, sir? Marisol finished, omitting the cruel word Valentina had used to describe his condition. A heavy silence filled the study. Alexander, his hands clasped in his lap, stared intently at Marisol with an unreadable expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and controlled. "Do you understand what you're doing, Marisol? You are accusing my future wife of betrayal and fraud." "I know, sir, and I swear on my father's memory that every word is true," she replied, holding his gaze with a firmness that surprised them both. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Do you have any proof? Recordings? Text messages? Anything concrete?" "No, sir," Marisol admitted, feeling her hopes sink. "Only what I saw and heard." "And you expect me to cancel my wedding? The biggest social event of the year based solely on the testimony of a housekeeper?" The harshness in his voice made Marisol flinch slightly. "Have you considered that perhaps you misunderstood what you heard, or that your personal feelings might be clouding your judgment?" Marisol's cheeks flushed. "What are you implying, sir?" "I'm not blind, Marisol. I have seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's understandable. Many women are drawn to power and money." Indignation washed over Marisol, replacing her initial nervousness. "You're wrong. I didn't come here out of jealousy or some twisted interest. I came because I thought you deserved to know the truth." "The truth," Alexander repeated bitterly. "In my experience, the truth is rarely as simple as it seems. Valentina could have had legitimate reasons for the conversation you think you heard." "Sir, please, that's enough," he cut in, raising a hand. "I appreciate your concern, but I will not tolerate any more baseless accusations against the woman I love. You may leave." Marisol stood frozen, tears threatening to spill. "Are you firing me, sir?" Alexander sighed, rubbing his temples. "No, Marisol, but I suggest you confine yourself to your duties for the remainder of your time here." With what dignity she could muster, Marisol gave a slight nod and left the study, the tears finally breaking free once the door closed behind her. Sleep was impossible that night. The adrenaline from the confrontation, mixed with the frustration of not being believed and the humiliation of Alexander's insinuations, kept Marisol tossing and turning until dawn. When the first rays of sun began to filter through her small window, she rose, exhausted but determined to carry out her duties one last time. After the wedding, she would find another job, far away from this mansion and the memories that now haunted her. The house was already a flurry of activity. The big day had arrived and dozens of people were rushing about, finalizing details. Valentina had stayed at a luxury hotel the night before, following the tradition of not seeing the groom before the ceremony. Despite her resolve to maintain her composure, Marisol couldn't stop fresh tears from welling up as she helped prepare the master suite for the wedding night. She placed rose petals on the king-size bed and arranged the scented candles exactly as Valentina had ordered, knowing it was all for naught. Unable to bear it any longer, she slipped out into the backyard, seeking a moment of solitude. She sat on a stone bench half hidden among the bougainvillea bushes and let the tears flow freely. The tears were not just for Alexander and the terrible fate that awaited him, but also for herself for having allowed herself to develop feelings for a man who could never see her as anything more than a servant. "Marisol?" Alexander's voice startled her so much she jumped to her feet, hastily wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Mr. Sterling, excuse me, I was just—" she stammered, mortified at being found in such a vulnerable state. Alexander approached slowly in his wheelchair, his expression much softer than the night before. "Don't apologize. I'm the one who should be apologizing for my behavior last night." Confused by this unexpected turn, Marisol remained silent, watching him. "I couldn't sleep," he continued, stopping his chair a few feet away. "Your words kept replaying in my mind, and as much as I resisted believing them, they also forced me to remember small details I had deliberately ignored." What details, sir?" Marisol asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The phone calls she ends abruptly when I enter a room, her insistence on the prenup when I didn't think it was necessary, her constant evasiveness when I try to talk about our future together." Alexander paused, his gaze lost among the garden flowers. And most of all, the way her smile never quite reaches her eyes when she tells me she loves me. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Marisol dared to speak. "What are you going to do, sir?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, running a hand over his tired face. "Part of me wants to call the whole thing off, to avoid the humiliation. But another part what? Another part refuses to believe it, or perhaps refuses to accept it. Maybe I'd rather face the possibility of being deceived than the certainty of being alone again." The vulnerability in his confession made Marisol's heart ache. "You deserve better than a lie, sir," she whispered with conviction. Alexander looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Not the efficient employee, not the young woman from the valley who followed orders, but the woman standing before him, her eyes red from crying, with an overwhelming sincerity in her gaze. "There's something in your eyes, Marisol," he said finally. "A truth that contrasts with everything that usually surrounds me. Maybe that's why I was so uncomfortable last night. I'm not used to such honesty. Honesty shouldn't be uncomfortable, sir. And yet, in my world, it is." Alexander gave a sad smile. "I've lived among falsehoods for so long I no longer know how to recognize what's real." He glanced at his watch and sighed. "I have to get ready. The ceremony is in 4 hours." "So, you're still going through with the wedding?" Marisol asked, unable to hide her disappointment. "I'm going through with it," he confirmed, "but with my eyes wide open. If Valentina is really planning what you think she is, we'll see who surprises whom today." As she watched Alexander move away down the garden path, Marisol felt a contradictory mix of hope and fear. He hadn't fully believed her warnings, but she had at least planted the seed of doubt. The clouds gathering on the horizon seemed to foreshadow the storm that was coming, not just in the sky, but in the lives of everyone in the Sterling mansion. A grand cathedral in Los Angeles glowed that afternoon. Its imposing towers, witnesses to a century of history, now looked down upon what promised to be the social event of the year. The entrance was flanked by arrangements of white orchids and roses imported from Holland, creating a floral tunnel leading into the sanctuary. Alexander Sterling waited at the altar, impeccable in his Italian designer suit. His wheelchair, specially crafted for the occasion, gleamed with discreet silver details that complemented the decor. Though his face wore a serene smile, his knuckles, white from gripping the arms of his chair, betrayed his inner tension. In the front row, his mother, Eleanor Sterling, widow of the founder of Sterling Dynamics, watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. Beside her sat the most important executives from his company, high-ranking politicians, and even a cabinet secretary. The cameras of society magazines flashed incessantly, immortalizing every moment. Marisol, dressed in the formal uniform Valentina had designed for the service staff attending the ceremony, stood discreetly in a side alcove of the cathedral. From there, she could see everything without being noticed. Her heart pounded, torn between the fear that her warnings would come true and a guilty hope that they would. The string quartet began to play the first notes of the wedding march. The 300 guests rose to their feet, turning toward the main entrance. The massive carved wooden doors swung open, revealing nothing. There was no bride waiting to make her grand entrance. The musicians, seasoned professionals, continued to play while exchanging confused glances. Alexander maintained his composure, though a muscle in his jaw began to twitch. 5 minutes turned into 10. A murmur began to spread through the attendees like a wave. Alexander gave a nearly imperceptible nod to Raymond, his personal assistant, who immediately slipped out a side door, phone in hand. "It's surely just a delay with the traffic," Father Michael commented, leaning toward Alexander with a reassuring smile that didn't hide his growing discomfort. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The string quartet, having exhausted its nuptial repertoire, began to improvise with classical pieces. Helena Sterling rose from her seat and approached her son, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of silent support. "Alexander," she whispered, "we could announce a small technical delay. Offer champagne in the narthex while we wait." "No, Mother," he replied, his voice calm, belying the storm in his eyes. "We'll wait here." At 30 minutes, the camera flashes were no longer capturing moments of anticipated joy, but the spectacle of an abandoned groom. The looks of pity, the barely concealed whispers, the awkward glances that avoided his own. Alexander registered them all as his mask of serenity began to crack. From her position, Marisol could see Alexander's knuckles turn from white to almost blue from the force with which he gripped his chair, as if he feared he might completely fall apart if he let go. Finally, after 45 endless minutes, Raymond reappeared. His devastated expression said it all. He approached Alexander and handed him an ivory-colored envelope identical to the invitations. The silence in the cathedral was so absolute that the sound of the envelope being torn open echoed like a gunshot. Marisol held her breath as she watched Alexander read the note. His face, controlled until that moment, briefly contorted into a mask of pure pain before hardening into an expression of cold fury. "Alexander!" His mother's worried voice barely pierced the fog of humiliation enveloping him. Without answering, he handed her the note. Eleanor read it quickly, her aristocratic features tightening with indignation. "Coward!" she muttered through clenched teeth, crumpling the paper in her fist. A particularly bold photographer edged too close, trying to capture the moment. The look Alexander shot him made him retreat instinctively. Father Michael cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should—" "Please, Father," Alexander interrupted, his voice controlled but taut. "I would like to address our guests." With a fluid motion, he turned his chair to face the congregation. The look of wounded dignity on his face was a dramatic contrast to the emotional chaos Marisol knew he must be experiencing. "Distinguished guests," he began, his voice ringing with a strength that surprised everyone. "As you can see, it appears there will be no wedding today. Miss Rivas has decided that our paths must diverge." A shocked murmur rippled through the church. "However," he continued, "since you are all here, and considering the reception is paid for, I invite you to join me in celebrating." "Celebrating what, son?" his mother asked, visibly concerned for his mental state. "My freedom, mother." Alexander's smile held not a trace of humor, and the lesson I've just learned about the true worth of people. The camera flashes intensified, capturing every second of this unexpected turn. Alexander, sitting tall in his chair with the dignity of a king, began to move down the center aisle. The guests, frozen in surprise, parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Marisol, seeing him approach, tried to melt into the shadows, but Alexander's eyes, sharpened by pain, found her immediately. For an instant, their gazes locked. There was no accusation in his eyes as she had feared, but a silent acknowledgement that she had been right all along. As Alexander passed her, he gently let the crumpled note fall. The paper tumbled to a stop by Marisol's feet. Instinctively, she bent to pick it up. "I couldn't marry a man I love less than his money. Goodbye forever. V." The cruel simplicity of the message made Marisol feel sick. There was no remorse, no explanation, just a final lie disguised as sudden honesty. The real message, which only the two of them understood, was the exact opposite. Valentina loved the money more than the man. Outside the cathedral, a storm of flashes greeted Alexander. The reporters, sensing a scandal, swarmed him with questions. "When did you know she would leave you? Is it true you signed a multi-million-dollar prenup? Do you think it was because of your physical condition?" Alexander ignored them all, moving relentlessly toward his vehicle, where Raymond waited with the door open. Only as he was about to get in did he stop and turn to the press. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would appreciate it if you would respect this difficult moment," he said with surprising calm. "And I assure you, this story is not over." The limousine pulled away under the overcast LA sky, carrying a man who had just experienced the greatest public humiliation of his life, but who in some incomprehensible way seemed stronger than ever. In the cathedral, as the guests began to disperse amid scandalized whispers, Marisol stood motionless, Valentina's note still in her hand. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not for the sadness of what had happened, but for the strange certainty that somehow everything had irrevocably changed for them all. The black limousine moved slowly through the streets of downtown Los Angeles. Inside, Alexander Sterling stared out the tinted window without truly seeing the urban landscape. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, humiliation, rage, and beneath it all a strange sense of liberation. "Where are we going, sir?" Raymond asked from the passenger seat. Alexander was silent for a few moments. The question seemed to encompass far more than just a geographical destination. "Turn around," he finally commanded. "We're going back to the cathedral." "Are you sure?" Raymond exchanged a worried glance with the driver in the rearview mirror. "Completely." Alexander's voice had taken on a firmness that surprised even himself. This story will not end with Alexander Sterling running away like a beaten dog. As the limousine made a U-turn, angering several other drivers, Alexander picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Mendoza, I need you at the cathedral immediately." "Yes, I know it's Sunday. Bring the prenuptial agreement and all related documents." "No, there was no wedding, but there will be consequences." When he hung up, a cold smile touched his lips. If Valentina thought she could humiliate him and still collect the 20 million stipulated in the contract, she was sorely mistaken. She hadn't considered a fundamental detail. In the world of American high-stakes business, contracts could be as flexible as the will of those with the power to interpret them. The cathedral was still in an uproar when the limousine returned. Guests milled about in small groups, trading scandalous remarks and morbidly curious glances. Most were already heading to their cars, assuming the social spectacle of the year was over. The reporters, however, remained like vultures, hoping to capture more details of the drama. When the limousine stopped at the main entrance, an expectant silence fell over the crowd. The door opened, and Alexander emerged with the dignity of a warrior returning to the battlefield. With a fluid motion, he took control of his wheelchair and moved toward the cathedral steps. "Mr. Sterling, the ramps are on the side," one of the organizers nervously pointed out. "Not today," Alexander replied. With a gesture, he signaled two of his bodyguards to approach. "Get me up." The men, trained to obey without question, lifted the chair with Alexander in it and ceremoniously carried him up the cathedral steps. The act, far from looking like a weakness, sent a clear message. Not even century-old architecture would stop Alexander Sterling from reclaiming his dignity. Inside the sanctuary, only a few stragglers and staff members remained, beginning to dismantle the decorations. Alexander scanned the space with an eagle eye until he found her, Marisol, quietly helping to gather the abandoned wedding programs from the pews. Their eyes met across the main nave. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. In Marisol's eyes there was no pity, the one thing Alexander dreaded most, but genuine compassion mixed with admiration for his return. Something stirred in Alexander's chest. His entire adult life, especially after the accident, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His money, his influence, his name. Even Valentina, with her stunning beauty and false love, had just been another one on that list. But this simple woman, who had risked her job to warn him of a betrayal, seemed to want nothing more than his well-being. Without a second thought, Alexander began moving toward her, ignoring the renewed murmurs around him. "What is he doing?" Elena Sterling whispered to Raymond, who could only shrug as bewildered as she was. Marisol, seeing Alexander heading directly for her, froze, the wedding program still in her hands. Her heart began to beat so hard she feared everyone could hear it. "Marisol," Alexander's voice echoed in the cathedral's acoustic space when he finally stopped in front of her. "You were right." "I'm so sorry, sir," she replied in a low voice, unsure how to react to this unexpected situation. "I'm not," he said with an enigmatic smile. "In fact, I think Valentina did me a favor." The few remaining guests, including Elena Sterling and several Sterling Dynamics executives, moved closer discreetly to listen, intrigued by this strange exchange between the jilted billionaire and a simple housekeeper. "She made me see what's real and what's fake," Alexander continued, unconcerned by his impromptu audience. "She made me to realize who was willing to risk everything to protect me, without expecting anything in return." Marisol felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Her cheeks burned and she didn't know where to look. "I owe you an apology, Marisol. I didn't believe you when I should have." "You don't have to apologize, sir. I understand." "No, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "Not only did I not believe you, but I accused you of having ulterior motives. But now I see the truth clearly. In a world full of fakes, you have been the only authentic thing." A photographer who had managed to sneak back into the cathedral began snapping pictures capturing the scene. Curiously, Alexander, always so protective of his privacy, didn't seem to notice or care. "Mr. Sterling," Raymond intervened, approaching nervously. "Mr. Mendoza has just arrived with the documents you requested." "Perfect," Alexander replied, without taking his eyes off Marisol. "Tell him to wait. I have something important to take care of first." What happened next left everyone present speechless. Alexander Sterling, one of the most powerful men in America, took Marisol's hand in his and, with an intensity that made her hold her breath, spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "Marisol Juarez, will you marry me? Not tomorrow, not in a month, today, right now. The silence that followed was so absolute, you could hear the whirring of the photographer's cameras as they, now alerted by frantic text messages from the remaining guests, swarmed back into the cathedral. What? The word escaped Marisol's lips like a disbelieving sigh. You heard me, he replied, his voice softer but just as resolute. I know it sounds crazy. Maybe it is, but today I've learned that sometimes madness is wiser than reason. But sir, we don't, Marisol stammered, unable to process what was happening. Is that a no? He asked, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his confident expression. It's not that, it's just, why me? Why now? Alexander smiled, this time with a genuine warmth he rarely showed. Because you're real, Marisol. On a day when everything has been a charade, you are the only authentic thing. And because, if I'm being completely honest, I think there's something poetic about turning the day of my greatest humiliation into the beginning of something true. Eleanor Sterling stepped forward, her face a mask of aristocratic concern. Alexander, son, have you lost your mind? You can't marry. The help, he finished for her, turning his chair slightly to face his mother. Why not? After all, I've just had proof that a good pedigree and social standing guarantee neither decency nor loyalty. Returning his attention to Marisol, whose face was a mix of confusion, fear, and something else, something that looked suspiciously like hope, Alexander softened his tone. You don't have to answer now if you don't want to. I understand this is sudden and probably absurd from any rational perspective. Marisol looked around, aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on her, Alexander's aristocratic mother, his elegant friends, the service staff, the scandal-hungry photographers. Then she looked back at Alexander, and in his eyes, she saw something she'd never noticed before. A spark of real life, of genuine emotion so different from the cold determination that usually defined him. And then, against all odds, against all logic, against all the unwritten rules of the world they lived in, Marisol Juarez, the young woman from California's Central Valley who had come to the coast seeking a better life, made the most improbable and courageous decision of her life. Yes, she answered, her voice barely audible at first, then gaining strength. Yes, I'll marry you. The camera flashes exploded like fireworks, immortalizing the moment their destinies changed forever. Time seemed to stand still in the cathedral. Marisol's yes was still echoing off the old stone walls when Alexander moved closer, taking her trembling hands in his. The camera flashes continued their frantic assault, capturing every second of the unexpected turn of events, but for the two of them, the outside world seemed to have momentarily faded away. I need to explain something, Alexander whispered, leaning in from his chair until his face was inches from hers. His voice was so low only Marisol could hear. This isn't about love, you understand. Marisol's heart gave a painful lurch, though she tried to keep her face from showing the sting she felt. What I'm proposing is an arrangement, he continued, his eyes locked on hers. I want to show everyone, especially Valentina, that I am not someone you can walk away from without consequences. I will not be the laughingstock of American society. Marisol nodded slightly, beginning to understand. It will be a marriage on paper only, Alexander explained, his voice still an urgent whisper. I promise you, you will be compensated generously. You'll be able to help your family, go to school if you want, have the life you've always dreamed of. Despite the coldness of the deal he was proposing, Marisol detected something in Alexander's eyes she had never seen before, an almost imperceptible vulnerability, a flicker of fear hidden behind his mask of control. This powerful man, used to dominating every situation, was at that moment completely at her mercy. A single word of refusal could shatter the last thing he had left, his pride. I understand, sir, she answered, also in a low voice. I accept your terms. Something akin to relief washed over Alexander's face. He nodded briefly before turning to the others. Father Michael, he called out, his voice loud and clear. It seems there will be a wedding after all. The priest, who had been watching the scene with the same bewilderment as everyone else, jumped at the sound of his name. But, Mr. Sterling, this is highly irregular, he stammered, visibly flustered. There are procedures, documents, counseling. The same documents that were ready for my wedding to Valentina will do, Alexander interrupted with the authority of a man used to his orders being followed without question. As for the counseling, I trust God will understand the exceptional circumstances. Elena Sterling approached her son, her face a combination of disbelief and aristocratic horror. "Alexander, you can't be serious," she hissed, leaning down so others wouldn't hear. "Marrying the help? Have you thought of the scandal? Of what our friends and business partners will say?" "You mean the same scandal we're already starring in, Mother," he replied with a cold smile. "At least now I get to control the narrative." Mr. Mendoza, the lawyer, who had just arrived with the requested documents, watched the scene with wide eyes. "Mr. Sterling," he interjected, nervously adjusting his tie, "I must inform you that the clause in the prenuptial agreement with Miss Rivas clearly states that if you marry another person within 24 hours of her abandonment, the financial penalty is automatically null and void." A smile of genuine satisfaction lit up Alexander's face. "You see, Mother, perfectly thought out." You knew this?" Elena asked, astonished. "Let's just say I had my suspicions," he replied enigmatically, "and I've always been cautious about the contracts I sign." While this conversation took place, Marisol stood motionless, still processing what was about to happen. Her entire life was changing in a matter of minutes. She would go from being a housekeeper to the wife of one of the richest and most influential men in America. Her head spun with the implications. Ms. Dolores, the head housekeeper, discreetly came to her side. "Child, do you know what you're doing?" she whispered with motherly concern. "This isn't a fairy tale." "I know, Ms. Dolores," Marisol answered, with a calmness she didn't feel. "It's an arrangement, a business deal." "Business and the heart are a bad mix," the older woman warned, squeezing her arm gently before retreating. The next few minutes passed in a fever dream. Raymond was dispatched to find a suitable dress for Marisol from one of the exclusive boutiques on Rodeo Drive, which made a rare exception to open on a Sunday for the billionaire. The few remaining guests were quickly informed of the change of plans, and those who had already left received urgent messages to return to the cathedral. To everyone's surprise, especially Alexander's, many chose to come back. The morbid curiosity of witnessing such an extraordinary spectacle outweighed any prior commitments. Meanwhile, Marisol was led to a small anteroom where two emergency-hired stylists worked frantically to transform her from a simple housekeeper into an impromptu bride. Staring at herself in the mirror as they applied makeup and styled her hair, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. "Are you sure about this, honey?" one of the stylists asked as she pinned a stray lock of hair. "All of America will be talking about you tomorrow." Marisol didn't answer right away. Her mind wandered to memories of her childhood, of her mother warning her about the dangers of the big city, of her youthful dreams of true love. None of it had prepared her for this moment. "I don't have a choice," she said finally, more to herself than to the stylist. "There are always choices, sweetie," the woman replied with the wisdom of someone who had seen it all. "But sometimes the craziest ones are the ones that change our lives forever." When Marisol reappeared at the entrance of the cathedral, a collective gasp swept through the congregation. The dress, though off the rack, fit her figure with unexpected elegance. It was simpler than the ostentatious gown Valentina had chosen, and perhaps for that very reason it highlighted Marisol's natural beauty in a way no one had noticed before. Alexander, waiting again at the altar, visibly caught his breath when he saw her. For a moment an unreadable emotion crossed his face before he regained his look of determination. With every step Marisol took toward the altar, she felt as if she were walking simultaneously toward her destiny and away from everything she had ever known. There was no wedding march, no groomsmen, none of the usual happy nervousness of a bride in love, just a quiet resolve and the strange feeling that somehow this was the path she was meant to take. When she finally reached Alexander, he held out his hand to her. Marisol took it, surprised by the warmth of his touch. "Ready?" he asked in a low voice. "Ready," she confirmed, finding an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. Father Michael, resigned to the situation, began the ceremony with visible discomfort. The traditional words about love, trust, and eternal devotion sounded almost ironic in the context of this marriage, born of revenge and convenience. When it came time for the vows, a thick silence fell over the congregation. All eyes were fixed on this unlikely couple, waiting to see if they would maintain the charade to the very end. "I, Alexander Sterling," he began in a clear, firm voice, "take you, Marisol Juarez, to be my lawful wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The words, though spoken as part of a calculated plan, resonated with an unexpected sincerity that surprised them both. When it was Marisol's turn, her voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. I, Marisol Juarez, take you, Alexander Sterling, to be my lawful husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. By the power vested in me, Father Michael concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. There was no cue for a kiss, nor did Alexander make a move to initiate one. Instead, he gently squeezed Marisol's hand and offered her a smile that, though reserved, held genuine gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, just for her to hear. And so, in a half-empty cathedral, under the incessant flashes of cameras and the stunned gazes of American high society, Marisol Juarez ceased to be an invisible housekeeper and became Mrs. Sterling. The impromptu reception was held in the same ballroom at the St. Regis that had been booked months ago to celebrate the union of Alexander and Valentina. The centerpieces of white orchids, the strategically placed scented candles, the gleaming dance floor, the jazz band on stage, everything remained the same. Only the bride and groom had changed. Marisol sat at the head table, still dazed by the events of the last few hours. The elegant ivory-colored dress Raymond had procured for the ceremony was a stark contrast to her usual grey uniform. Her hands, accustomed to hard work, now sported a quick manicure and an engagement ring that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, placed there minutes before the ceremony when he realized they had no wedding bands. More champagne, ma'am? A waiter asked, bowing respectfully. He was the same person who, just days before, had barely given her a second glance when she worked alongside him. No, thank you, Marisol replied softly, still uncomfortable with the sudden shift in how she was treated. From her seat, she could see the guests who had decided to attend this bizarre turn of events. There were less than half of the original invitees, but still, the cream of the crop of Los Angeles society was present. Some out of genuine curiosity, others for sheer morbid entertainment, and a few, Alexander's true friends, out of loyalty. She watched them exchange glances and whisper behind their champagne flutes, analyzing every detail of this extraordinary situation. The word scandal hung in the air like the expensive perfume worn by the women. Alexander, for his part, seemed surprisingly at ease. He moved among the guests with his usual confidence, accepting clearly forced congratulations, with a smile that revealed more satisfaction than real joy. Every so often, his eyes would find Marisol's, as if to check that she was still there, that this improvised plan hadn't yet fallen apart. You should eat something, Elena Sterling said, sitting down next to her new daughter-in-law with the stiffness of someone performing an unpleasant duty. You've barely touched your plate. I don't have much of an appetite, ma'am, Marisol replied, intimidated by the matriarch's presence. Elena studied her with critical eyes. I suppose that's understandable, under the circumstances. She paused, adding in a lower voice, I don't know what my son is thinking, but I want you to know that I do not approve of this union. However, for Alexander's sake, I will keep up appearances. Before Marisol could respond, the opening chords of a waltz began to play. The band announced the newlyweds' first dance, another tradition no one had had time to cancel. A murmur of expectation went through the ballroom. How would the groom in a wheelchair dance? Would the housekeeper-turned-bride know how to waltz? Smartphones were discreetly raised, ready to capture any embarrassing moment. Alexander approached the head table, his expression unreadable. May I have this dance? He asked formally, extending his hand to Marisol. But you... the chair, she stammered, confused. I have my ways, he replied with an enigmatic smile. Her heart pounding, Marisol took his hand and followed him to the dance floor. To her surprise, Alexander gestured to Raymond, who approached with another chair, this one, an elegant but standard wheelchair. Just for special occasions, Alexander explained as Raymond helped him transfer. He then locked the braces on his legs. I can't feel them, but my legs can support me for short periods. Marisol held her breath as Alexander stood, supported by discreet orthopedic braces hidden under his trousers. He was taller than she had imagined, and for a moment she felt even more intimidated. He placed one hand on her waist while holding her other hand firmly. Just follow my lead, he whispered, and don't worry about mistakes. Smile and no one will notice. The waltz began, and to the astonishment of everyone present, The couple glided across the floor with unexpected grace. Alexander's movements were limited but precise, guiding Marisol with the confidence of someone who had taken dance lessons his entire life. She, in turn, followed his lead with a natural intuition that surprised them both. "You're a quick study," he commented, genuinely impressed. "My grandfather taught me to dance at the fiestas in my town," she replied, allowing herself a small smile. As they turned slowly, Alexander noticed that Marisol's hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes held a serene determination that contrasted with her physical nervousness. There was something about that combination of vulnerability and strength that he found fascinating. The hired photographers, and the impromptu ones with smartphones, captured every moment. What had started as a potential media disaster was transforming into an almost romantic image, the billionaire and the housekeeper, dancing as if the world around them had disappeared. "They're buying our story," Alexander murmured, leaning in slightly. "What story is that, sir?" Marisol asked, her voice barely audible over the music. "The one about a man who found true love where he least expected it," he answered with a cynical smile. "The classic modern fairy tale. Tomorrow will be on every cover, not as the tragedy Valentina hoped for, but as an unexpected romance." Marisol nodded, understanding his strategy. "It's a good plan. The best plans are the ones you improvise when everything else fails," he replied, and for a moment he seemed to be talking more to himself than to her. When the waltz ended, the guests applauded with an enthusiasm that surprised the couple. What had begun as a morbid spectacle had transformed into something almost charming. Marisol's authenticity and Alexander's determination had created an unexpected chemistry that was hard to ignore. Back at the head table, as Alexander returned to his primary wheelchair, a waiter approached with a small note for him. As he read it, his face hardened for a moment. "Is something wrong?" Marisol asked, noticing the change. "Valentina is in the lobby," he answered in a low voice. "She wants to speak with me." A pang of fear shot through Marisol. "Are you going to see her?" "Of course," he replied with a cold smile. "It would be rude not to receive a guest, wouldn't it?" As Alexander headed toward the entrance of the ballroom, Marisol remained in her seat, suddenly aware of how fragile this new world of hers was. What if Valentina convinced Alexander it was all a misunderstanding? What if he decided this whole improvised plan was too extreme? To her surprise, however, Raymond approached her a few moments later. "Mr. Sterling requests your presence, ma'am," he said formally. "He says it's important that you are by his side to receive the visitor." Her heart pounding, Marisol followed Raymond to a small private lounge adjacent to the main ballroom. There she found Alexander, perfectly composed, waiting across from Valentina, whose perfect face was contorted with fury. "Ah, Marisol, darling," Alexander said, holding out his hand to her. "My wife," he emphasized, looking directly at Valentina. The model, dressed in an elegant black suit that suggested she had come straight from another engagement, looked Marisol up and down with barely concealed contempt. "Is this your grand revenge, Alexander? Marrying the maid?" Her voice dripped with venom. "I thought you had more class." "And I thought you had more intelligence," he replied calmly. "Did you really think I wouldn't read every word of that prenup? Or that I wouldn't notice the little inconsistencies in your behavior?" Valentina paled slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do. And I also think you've just discovered that, thanks to Clause 23B, you won't be receiving a single cent of the 20 million you were counting on." Alexander's smile was that of a predator who has cornered its prey. "In fact, according to the terms you yourself insisted on, you might owe me compensation for damages to my public image." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, with unspoken emotion. Finally, Valentina turned to Marisol. "Enjoy it while it lasts, dear," she said with a poisonous smile. "Men like Alexander always get bored of simple toys." Against all odds and surprising even herself, Marisol replied with a calmness she didn't know she possessed. "I'd rather be a simple toy than a fake one, Miss Rivas." Valentina, with no other weapon at her disposal, turned on her heel and swept out of the lounge with all the dignity she could muster. When the door closed behind her, Alexander looked at Marisol with a new expression on his face, something between surprise and admiration. "I'll remember not to underestimate you," he said with a genuine smile, the first Marisol had seen from him all day. And in that moment, as they returned together to the ballroom where their improbable wedding celebration continued, something subtly shifted between them. It wasn't love, not even friendship yet, but it was the beginning of a mutual respect that neither of them had anticipated when this strange day began. The Sterling mansion settled into an odd calm in the months following the wedding. The initial media storm, sensationalist covers, speculative reports, and declined interviews gradually died down for lack of new scandals to fuel public curiosity. The story of the paraplegic billionaire and his housekeeper-turned-wife began to lose traction in social circles, replaced by new gossip from the American elite. For Marisol and Alexander, however, each day was a careful exercise in adapting to their new and peculiar situation. After returning from a brief, discreet honeymoon in Big Sur, more for appearances than genuine romance, they established a routine that, to the surprise of both, proved less awkward than expected. Marisol had been moved into one of the main suites in the mansion, not Alexander's, but an adjoining one, elegantly decorated and with its own marble bathroom. A full wardrobe of designer clothes awaited her, courtesy of the stylists Alexander had hired to transform his new wife. Yet, every morning, as the first rays of sun filtered through the silk curtains, Marisol woke with the same humility that had always defined her. She dressed in simple yet elegant outfits, rejecting the ostentatious dresses and flashy jewelry, opting for a quiet elegance that, without her knowing, made her stand out even more. "Good morning, Ms. Dolores," she would greet the head housekeeper each morning, who at first didn't know how to treat her former colleague. "Is Mr. Sterling's coffee ready?" "Yes, ma'am," Dolores would invariably reply, still uncomfortable with the new dynamic. "Lilia is preparing it now." "Let me do it," Marisol would say, heading to the kitchen. "You know he likes it a very specific way." This simple act, personally preparing Alexander's coffee each morning, was the first of many small gestures that began to weave a delicate thread of connection between the new husband and wife. She didn't do it out of obligation or servitude, but out of a genuine consideration that was a natural part of her character. Alexander noticed these details. The coffee served at the exact temperature he preferred. The fresh bougainvillea from the garden on his desk each morning, replacing the expensive imported orchids Valentina had always demanded. The way Marisol listened intently during dinners when he spoke of his business projects, asking simple but intelligent questions that sometimes made him consider angles he hadn't contemplated. "Have you thought about how that new app would affect older people, like my Aunt Remedios?" she asked one night, as Alexander explained a new tech project. "She can barely use WhatsApp. Anything more complicated would completely exclude her." That simple observation led Alexander to order a complete overhaul of the user interface, eventually resulting in a much more accessible and, therefore, more commercially successful product. For Marisol, each day was a delicate balance between her new position and her true self. She declined Alexander's offer to hire additional staff, preferring to keep the house running with the same team. But she no longer cleaned or did laundry. Instead, she supervised discreetly, helping out when needed, and ensuring the mansion ran with the same efficiency as before. "I don't understand why you still worry about these things," Alexander commented one afternoon, watching her personally arrange a vase of flowers. "We could hire the best interior decorators in the city. Some things feel different when you do them yourself," she replied simply. "Not everything can be bought." That sentence stayed with Alexander for days, echoing in his mind at unexpected moments. He, who had grown up in a world where everything had a price, was beginning to glimpse a different perspective through Marisol's eyes. 3 months after the wedding, People magazine published an article titled "The Sterling Marriage Is the Fairy Tale for Real?", speculating on the surprising stability of the couple everyone had assumed would last a few weeks at most. According to close sources, the article read, "Alexander Sterling seems more focused than ever, and his new wife has shown a dignity and discretion that has impressed even the most elite circles of Beverly Hills." Elena Sterling, who had initially minimized her contact with the couple, began visiting the mansion more frequently, intrigued by the subtle changes she saw in her son. "You look well, Alexander," she commented during one of these visits. "More at peace." "I've been having fewer headaches," he replied casually, though they both knew he was referring to more than just physical symptoms. One July night, as a thunderstorm raged over Los Angeles, Alexander awoke with a start from a particularly loud clap of thunder. The phantom pain in his legs, a cruel irony of his condition, tormented him on nights like this. He usually endured these episodes alone, refusing painkillers that would cloud his mind. This time, however, the soft sound of a piano melody reached his room. Intrigued, he maneuvered his chair into the hallway and followed the music to the main living room. There, illuminated only by the intermittent flashes of lightning, he found Marisol playing the piano that had been silent since his accident. "I didn't know you played," he said, startling her. Marisol stopped immediately, embarrassed. "I'm sorry if I woke you. It's just the storm." "They wake me too," he admitted, moving closer. "The storms and the pain in legs I no longer feel." It was the first time he had openly mentioned his phantom pain. With Valentina, he had always maintained a facade of unflappable strength, afraid that any show of vulnerability would diminish his appeal. "My grandmother used to say that music soothes the aches that medicine can't touch," Marisol replied. "Do you want me to keep playing?" Alexander nodded, positioning his chair next to the piano. As Marisol resumed the soft, haunting folk melody her schoolteacher had taught her years ago, Alexander closed his eyes and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to simply feel without analyzing. The next morning, Raymond found them both in the living room, Alexander asleep in his chair and Marisol curled up on a nearby sofa, a book open on her lap. He discreetly retreated without waking them. At breakfast, neither mentioned the incident from the night before, but something had subtly changed. The invisible barrier they maintained, the formality of their arrangement, was beginning to blur. That afternoon, Alexander called his office and cancelled all his meetings. "Marisol," he said, finding her in the garden, "would you like to go to the Getty Center today? They have an exhibit on folk art that you might find interesting." It wasn't a romantic date, he told himself, just a gesture of thanks for her company during the storm. But when he saw the genuine joy light up Marisol's face, something inside him stirred in a way he hadn't anticipated. As they toured the museum halls, Alexander found himself watching Marisol more than the art. The way her eyes lit up at pieces that reminded her of home, the way she explained traditional weaving techniques she had learned as a child, the humility with which she shared her knowledge without pretense. There was an authenticity to her that was a dramatic contrast to the calculated world he had moved in his entire life. "You're a box of surprises, Marisol Juarez Sterling," he commented as they headed home. She smiled, not knowing what to say. For her too, this strange marriage was transforming into something she hadn't foreseen. The distant, authoritative man she had known as her employer was revealing layers of depth, intelligence, and surprisingly, vulnerability she never would have imagined. The following weeks brought more of these shared moments, long breakfasts where they discussed the news, afternoons in the garden where Marisol read aloud to him while he worked on his laptop, dinners with fewer awkward silences and more genuine conversation. The press, which had been eagerly awaiting the seemingly inevitable divorce announcement, began to spin new theories about the Sterling marriage, that it had been a secret love affair all along, that Valentina had just been a front, that the jilting had been staged by Alexander himself. None came close to the truth, which was both simpler and more complex. Two people who had entered into a pragmatic arrangement were discovering day by day that they had found something neither had been consciously looking for. It wasn't love, not yet, but in the quiet of their shared routines, in the small gestures of mutual consideration, in the glances that lingered a second longer than necessary, a transformation as profound as it was silent was taking place. The garden of the Sterling mansion glowed under the golden light of dusk. Hundreds of candles in glass lanterns created a luminous path between arches of bougainvillea and jasmine. The scent of gardenias floated in the air, mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet playing classic jazz standards. Marisol watched the preparations from her bedroom window, intrigued. Alexander had been mysterious for the past few weeks, making secret phone calls and holding closed-door meetings with Raymond. When she asked about all the unusual activity, he replied with an enigmatic smile, "It's a surprise for our anniversary. I just need you to be ready at 7 and wear this." This turned out to be an exquisite pearl-colored gown, simple in its design but clearly couture. Beside it, a small velvet box held a delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother. As she got ready, Marisol reflected on the past year. A year that had begun as a cold marriage of convenience and had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it all changed, because there was no single dramatic revelation. It was more an accumulation of small moments, midnight conversations, shared laughter, comfortable silences, and finally, 3 months ago, the first real kiss, awkward, unexpected, during a private movie screening in the mansion's theater. Since then, Alexander had moved into Marisol's suite. There were no grand declarations or eternal promises, just the quiet certainty that they both wanted to be together, beyond the social contract that had initially united them. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she answered, finishing clasping the necklace. Elena Sterling entered, elegant as always in a midnight blue suit. Her attitude toward Marisol had gradually evolved from thinly veiled disdain to a cautious respect, especially after seeing the positive change in her son. "You look beautiful," she said with sincerity. "Alexander is waiting for you in the garden. Do you know what he's planning?" Marisol asked, nervous about all the mystery. Elena smiled slightly. "I do, and I think you'll be surprised." She paused, then added, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I was wrong about you, Marisol." With these enigmatic words, Eleanor offered her arm. "Shall we? It's not proper to keep the groom waiting." "Groom?" Marisol frowned, confused. As she stepped into the garden, the answer materialized before her eyes. The space had been transformed into an open-air chapel, floral arches, chairs decorated with silk ribbons, a small platform where a priest waited, and in front of him, Alexander in an elegant black suit, seated in his wheelchair, but with a posture that radiated a confidence Marisol had never seen in him, and all around, to her utter shock, were many of the same guests who had witnessed that fateful day in the cathedral 1 year ago. But this time, their faces reflected not morbid curiosity or pity, but genuine joy. "What is all this?" Marisol whispered, overwhelmed. "A vow renewal," Elena replied. "Alexander's idea. He said he wants to do it right this time." Her heart pounding, Marisol walked down the petal-strewn path toward Alexander. Their eyes never left each other, communicating in the silent language they had developed over the past year. When she reached his side, Alexander took her hands in his. The priest began the ceremony, but Marisol barely heard the ritualistic words. Her entire being was focused on Alexander, on the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the world. When it came time for the vows, Alexander gestured for the priest to let him speak first. In a clear voice that carried across the garden, he began, "Exactly 1 year ago, we stood in a very different situation. I was hurt, humiliated, blinded by pride and revenge. I asked you to marry me not out of love but out of spite. It was probably the most impulsive and selfish decision of my life." He paused, his voice trembling slightly before he continued, "And it turned out to be, without a doubt, the best decision I have ever made." A murmur of approval went through the guests. "Over this past year, I have discovered in you what I never believed existed. An authentic love that isn't based on what I can offer or buy. A love that shows itself in every small gesture, in every sincere word, in every look that sees past my wheelchair, my fortune, and my walls." Marisol could feel tears welling in her eyes. "With you, Marisol, I've learned that true wealth isn't kept in bank vaults. It's in waking up every morning next to someone who truly sees you, in your entirety, with your strengths and your weaknesses. It's in the shared silences, the unexpected laughter, the little details no one else would notice." Alexander took a breath, visibly emotional. "So today, in front of the same people who witnessed our peculiar beginning, I want to do things right, not as the wounded billionaire seeking revenge, but as the imperfect, vulnerable man that I am, asking you to continue to be my wife, my partner, my best friend, this time for love, only for love." By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even Elena Sterling, known for her stoicism, was discreetly dabbing a tear. It was Marisol's turn. She had never imagined she would have to speak in front of America's elite, yet looking at Alexander, everyone else seemed to fade away. "When I came to this house a little over 1.5 years ago, I was invisible, just another employee, part of the furniture." Her voice, though soft, carried a conviction that surprised many. "But in my invisibility, I was able to see things others didn't. I saw your loneliness behind the power. I saw your kindness hidden behind the harsh exterior. I saw the man, not the billionaire." She took a deep breath before continuing. "The day you asked me to marry you in the cathedral, I accepted for reasons I didn't fully understand myself. Maybe it was compassion, maybe loyalty, maybe—" She glanced down briefly, gathering courage, and when she looked back at Alexander, Her eyes shone with a truth she could no longer hide. Or maybe it was because, without realizing it, I had been quietly falling in love with you for a long time. With your strength, your determination, the way you treated your staff when you thought no one was watching, the way you talked about your projects with such passion, the way you played the piano when you thought no one could hear. Alexander looked at her, stunned, as if discovering a whole new side to her. This year hasn't been an arrangement for me, Alexander. It's been a dream I never dared to have. And today, in front of everyone, I want to tell you that I love you. Not the billionaire, not the successful entrepreneur, but the man who laughs at my bad jokes, who listens intently when I talk about my hometown, who looks at me as if I'm the most precious thing in his world. After the vows, the priest pronounced them once again, husband and wife. This time, when Alexander drew Marisol in for a kiss, it wasn't the measured, calculated kiss they had shared for appearances at their first wedding. It was real, deep, and filled with all the emotions they had built together over this extraordinary year. Applause erupted in the garden. This time the cameras capturing the moment weren't looking for a scandal, but for the culmination of a love story that had been born from the most unlikely of circumstances. Later, during dinner, with the celebration in full swing, Alexander approached Marisol, who was chatting with Ms. Dolores. "May I steal you for a moment?" he asked, taking her hand. Alexander guided his chair to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the party's bustle. "Did you really love me even back then?" he asked, a vulnerability in his voice that contrasted with his usual confidence. Marisol smiled, sitting on a bench beside him. "Ever since I saw you playing the piano one night, when you thought you were alone. You played with so much emotion. It was the first time I saw past the demanding boss." Alexander shook his head, marveling. "You were always the only one who truly saw, Marisol. When everyone, myself included, only saw appearances, you saw the truth. And you're the only one who has ever truly seen me," she replied, gently stroking his cheek. "Not the housekeeper, not the wife of convenience, but Marisol." Under the starry Los Angeles sky, surrounded by the soft murmur of the party in the distance, they sealed with a kiss the extraordinary story that had begun with an abandonment and blossomed into the most authentic love either of them had ever thought possible.